The first time that I was in Greece, I awoke while it was still dark in Athens and made my way down to a little Orthodox chapel. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and candles and from an accumulation of many, many years of worship. And the walls were covered with icons depicting not just biblical stories the way most stained glass windows in churches tend to do, but rather depicting aspects of God and of Jesus and of the saints. You see a two-dimensional picture of Jesus holding an open book in front of him, and that one is called Christ the Teacher. You see another one of Jesus holding a closed book, and that one is Christ the Judge. But the images of Jesus on the cross are the most notable in Eastern Orthodox cathedrals because in them Jesus is never portrayed as suffering. If the image is at all realistic, it shows Jesus as dead, expressionless, but never wearing a crown of thorns. Some actually depict him as being fully clothed, eyes open, totally calm, more a vision of the resurrected Christ superimposed over a cross rather than the tortured Nazarene. It would not be hard to see how in very many ways the religion on display in that Orthodox chapel in Greece bore no resemblance whatsoever to the religion that I was taught in rural Kentucky, and even less similarity to the religion that we typically practice here in a progressive church. There is not one Christianity, and there are certainly more divisions than the basics of Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox. When you leave this parking lot and go home, as I typically do, turning south on Eastgate, you drive past first a Spanish-speaking Pentecostal church, then a fairly fringe, far right-wing Baptist church, then a Christian Science church, and then a Southern Baptist church. If you stopped in each one of these churches as you drove down Eastgate and asked their members to describe Jesus to you, you would hear about a different individual in every single one of those churches, and none of them would describe Jesus anything like the human take that we take on that Palestinian reformer and revolutionary as we tend to see Jesus here. I grew up in a Protestant Reformation movement that was born in America in the midst of a Back to the Bible movement. Those 18th and 19th century evangelists, Walter Scott, Thomas and Alexander Campbell, believed that if only everyone would set aside their creedal statements, their doctrinal statements, and just read the Bible, if we just went back to the Bible, that we would be reunited and there would be one church and one Christianity. Now, those were not ignorant men, but they were blinded by their ideology. They did read the Bible. Unlike many fundamentalist and right-wing churches today, they actually were educated in Scripture. Alexander Campbell even translated the Bible himself from Greek into the American English of his day. What they all missed, however, is that there are several contradictory and competing images of Jesus in the four Gospels. They are not simply four different perspectives on the same thing. They are four different visions. In fact, the fourth Gospel, John, describes Jesus in a way that is radically different from the Jesus encountered in the Synoptic Gospels. John was not written simply to add to the witness of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He was trying to articulate a faith that was, compared to the other three Gospels, actually rather more Gnostic, more mystical, more divine than the Synoptics. And yet, it was written as a corrective to the surrounding culture that had gone much more Gnostic than John was, much more interested in otherworldly aspects of faith. There are those in John's world who taught that Christ had never actually been in a human body. He only appeared like a ghost to look like a human, but was never physically present in the world. They kept pushing Jesus up into the clouds, into a heavenly deity, and that is where John wanted to draw the line. John adamantly pulled Jesus down out of the clouds and presented a resurrected Jesus, fully in flesh and still bearing the nail holes and the wound from the spear that he earned while on the cross. For everyone who ever put their arm around you at a memorial for someone that you loved and told you, don't be sad, don't cry, because they're in a better place now. For everyone who told you in the midst of crisis that your pain doesn't matter, that the betrayal you've endured shouldn't hurt you because your home is in heaven. Your hope is in God. All things work together for the good of those who love the Lord. And the Lord never gives you more than you can bear. Or that really malevolent one, God gave you this burden to make you stronger, to perfect your faith, or because God knew that you could handle it. John says to the culture of his day that had given up in many very real ways on the real world in favor of an imaginary world. He said, you think suffering doesn't really matter? Try hanging from a couple of nails through your hands for 2 days and see if pain matters to you then. And though John is clearly attempting to correct the earlier Gospels on many points, particularly Luke, and if you remember lectures that David Trobish delivered here a couple of years ago, it's fairly evident that John has a copy of Luke in front of him, and he is making Jesus more divine than Luke was willing to do. John is reworking the structure of Luke to make it a more otherworldly kind of religion. And yet, when it comes down to this text that we read today, where the resurrected Jesus is saying, you got to know it's me. Look at these nail holes in my hands. How many people do you know that's got those? John not only reiterates that part of Luke, but he expands upon it and invites Thomas to stick his fingers in the hole, stick his hand in his side where the spear was. John is written as a corrective to Luke, as a corrective to the very popular Marcion religion of the day. But Christianity never was confined to either churches or bookstores. When the apostles were dead, when Jerusalem's temple had been destroyed, in those days when the empire held unquestioned power, mystery religions flourished. Religions that denied the importance of this world, that focused entirely upon the unseen, the unknowable, spiritual, otherworldly existence that the poor hope for when all hope in this world is gone. We've seen the same thing in American history, in the heavenly hopes common among African slaves who had nothing decent to hope for in this life, among the poor and uneducated peasant working classes that turned to excited revivalism and Pentecostalism so that they could raise their spirits out of the slums, the tenement houses, the tedious, backbreaking, and often dangerous labor in which they were trapped. I've been in a lot of rural villages in the jungles of Central America where the only religion you encounter is not what you might hope for, a defiant liberation theology that threatens to bring down an oppressive government and to throw out the exploitative landlords that have enslaved them in coffee and banana plantations. What you actually encounter in those contexts is almost always the religions of pie in the sky in the not too distant by and by. This is what is happening to the Christian religion in the time of John. The actual historical Jesus has no interest to John. I recently had a friend who encouraged me to let go of some of my own past injuries with the attitude of a young puppy, saying that if you can't play with it or eat it, just pee on it and move on. And there is a part of me that wishes that I could be that cavalier. Okay, you don't want to be my friend anymore because I refuse to join you in your superstitious beliefs? Fine, I'll just make new friends. But life doesn't really work that way because you can't make new parents. You can't make new siblings. You can't make new children. Those losses are painful. And you don't do yourself any favors by pretending that the pain isn't real. We don't want to become so hard-hearted that we can lose close connections and not be hurt by the loss. When I first moved to the Ozarks 24 years ago, I made an obligatory journey down to Eureka Springs to visit the Christ of the Ozarks, that giant statue of the resurrected Jesus that is emerging out of an Ozark mountaintop. Beyond the fact that it was constructed by that old racist E.B. Smith, the whole thing was pretty offensive to me. It struck me in much the way that Las Vegas struck me the one time that I visited there. It's big, it's tacky, and it seems very fake and manipulative in its intent in taking your money away from you. Now, the Christ of the Ozarks has structural issues, lots of missing concrete and cracks. But Jesus is also buried up to his knees in the mountain because once construction had started, E.B. Smith discovered that he would have to put a flashing red light on top of Jesus' head to warn low-flying aircraft. So to get it underneath that altitude, he buried Jesus up to his knees. So now if he put his arms down, his knuckles would drag the ground. Very similar to E.B. Smith and the KKK people who originally funded the construction of that statue. But what strikes me the most about the statue is the offensive fact that the Jesus he portrays has no scars. In both John and Luke, it is important to them when they are writing their metaphorical accounts of resurrection appearances that the only way to be sure that it is Jesus is because he's wounded. In fact, the gospel writers seem never to tire of pointing out that his followers couldn't even recognize him. They didn't know who he was by looking at his face. The only way that they knew who he was by looking at his wounds. The past cannot be undone. I would even argue that we shouldn't try to be cavalier about our past. Our wounds are real, and in a very real way, they make us who we are. Kierkegaard said, life must be lived forward but can only be understood backwards. Your present moment only makes sense by owning, analyzing, realizing what you've learned from your bad experiences. I've lost friends over the past decade that I thought would always be a part of my life. They were people that I loved, but the correspondence slows down, the phone calls taper off, and it comes to a complete stop. I don't know how much of that is because of theological differences or the way that I have interpreted our recent American wars or the whole complex of economic and moral crises related to our social justice work. Sometimes it was a newspaper article, and sometimes it was just because it's not that easy to be my friend. I know that most of you have had similar losses. Pastorally, I want to say this about that. Never give in to revenge. Never wound someone back because they have wounded you. Retaliating with rejection, as well as it may work for puppies, is beneath who you are striving to be. There's a saying from the Desert Fathers that teaches that the fire you kindle against your enemies burns you. We cannot allow ourselves to just bleed arterially for the rest of our lives. When you've been cut, you have to eventually try to stop bleeding. You cannot just obsess or forever grieve those losses, but there's nothing to be gained by protecting yourself by building a wall of resentment and distance. You won't often catch me quoting Max Lucado, in fact, probably never again. But I like what he says about forgiveness. He says, forgiveness is unlocking the door to set someone free and realizing that the prisoner was you. The wounds are real and they will always be a part of you. But you have the right, in fact, you have the obligation to continue to be true to yourself. The Buddha taught that there are three things that cannot remain hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth. You don't have to pretend to be what you are not to make other people more comfortable. You don't have to change them, and you can always be the one who is ready to be reconciled. You can always be the one that keeps the door open and keeps a candle in the window that says, I will go the extra mile. I will suspend judgment. I will forgive past wrongs. I will be the healer of broken relationships. But you do not do that by pretending to be what you are not. Regardless of whether you believe that you will live on in some form after your mortal life is ended, this world matters. Your life matters. And the wounds in our society matter. Warfare matters. Illness matters. Poverty, illiteracy, hunger, domestic violence, addiction, racism, all matter. Pollution matters. Discrimination matters. So does divorce, broken families, betrayals, false friends, lovelessness, loneliness, isolations. All of your wounds matter because they happen in the real world. No one should ever try to take that away from you. And so we seek a faith that is engaged in the real world and not constantly forcing people into an imaginary world. We hope to bind up real wounds and not by denying their importance. By the power of our shared faith, I implore you to try not to eat food that's been harvested by slaves. Try to wear clothing that was not manufactured by slaves. Work to raise the minimum wages of the people who cook your food, even if that means that you have to pay more for it. Don't just take the path of least resistance. Recycle, conserve energy. Don't listen to gossip. Don't tell lies that hurt other people. Don't despise paying taxes that give children better schools, safer homes, and better neighborhoods. Don't assume that if you have health insurance, that the illness of the elderly poor and the children of the poor do not matter. Don't think that because you don't read the news, that the world isn't still happening just because you've insulated yourself from awareness. Care. Get involved. Be willing to make personal sacrifices. If, as we say here, that love is our religion, surely that means that you love someone other than yourself. May we, the wounded, the really wounded, become the healers of the world. Amen.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Rev. Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.